Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. A lot of people like to say that reparations has become a divisive issue, but that's not true at all. Reparations has not become a divisive issue, it has always been a divisive issue. Because this country is based on a system of racial stratification, with black people being artificially held at the very bottom. This country didn't really care about having immigrants in big numbers until after the end of chattel slavery. Race in the United States was a binary equation up until that point, literally as simple as black and white. What this did was to make the issue of race into a 50-50 equation as far as justice is concerned. The white supremacists needed to thwart justice every single time. Black people, on the other hand, only needed to bring justice about once in order to make a major change in the society. This presented white power with a dilemma. Going back to chattel slavery was impossible, and with the advent of the Industrial Revolution, it was undesirable. They had the wealth generated by black labor. The game now was to make sure that the rightful recipients of that wealth, the black American slaves who built the country as well as their children, were denied the fruits of their own labor. But black numbers were significant, especially in the South, where up to 2 out of 5 people were black. So how could they prevent black people from using the mechanisms of democracy and representative government in order to bring about democracy through representative government? There is absolutely nothing that white supremacy will not weaponize if it can, and that includes the movement of people around the world. There have been a number of harebrained schemes that have been talked about, including Abraham Lincoln's proposal that all black people in America should be rounded up en masse and just deported. But that was impractical, and the newly freed slaves weren't going to go along with that. So, if they weren't able to reduce the number of black people in the United States, then their solution would be to bring in more non-black people from outside the U.S. If you look at demographic charts from the 19th century, you see that the numbers for the portions of the country with the most citizens, principally the Northeast, South, and Midwest, stayed relatively the same from 1840 until about 1860. Only the Midwest saw a steady increase before 1860, mainly because not so many people were living out there. And the population of the West remained flat because manifest destiny wasn't a thing yet. But both the South and Northeast began to grow significantly after 1860. So what changed? Immigration. Irish immigrants, Scottish immigrants, German immigrants, lots of Germans. The government decided that if black people's numbers couldn't be reduced, then the numbers of non-black people in the country had to be increased. The racial pyramid is the system white power rests upon. Every group is assigned a place within that pyramid, with those classified as white placed at the very top. Now, those groups who are beneath them don't have to like being in what position they're assigned, just so long as they accept their place within it. And when you look at the historical record and contemporary society, there's no denying that's exactly what happened. As long as black people were assigned the bottom of the pyramid, then violence by the state would be used to keep it this way, as well as the state supporting racist mobs who would run around harming black people in black enclaves. We saw this with the draft riots in the 19th century, which I've detailed on this channel. In that instance, you had Irish immigrants who up until that point had been fighting the British just a few weeks earlier and swearing blood oaths to drive the English out of Ireland, and yet when they got to the United States, they immediately made common cause with the cousins and oftentimes family members of those same English oppressors. It was understood that in the United States, the stratification was not based on religion or ethnic group. The hierarchy would be based solely on skin color. The signs back then said no dogs or Irish allowed. White power would set up a pattern and practice of hazing the newcomers from Europe as a means of showing them what it's like to be on the outside looking in, what it means to not be white in America. And this practice of giving the cold shoulder to European immigrants was not new. Benjamin Franklin himself said that the United States should ban Germans and the Swedish from immigrating to the U.S. because they were too swarthy for his tastes. Now, what you're seeing on your screen right now is an excerpt posted in the Washington Post from a letter that Benjamin Franklin wrote in 1751. This was before the establishment of the United States of America. And in this letter, Benjamin Franklin had written that he didn't consider most of Europe to be white. His exact words: "The number of purely white people in the world is proportionably very small. And in Europe, the Spaniards, Italians, French, Russians, and Swedes are generally of what we call a swarthy complexion." as are the Germans also. The Saxons only accepted who, with the English, make the principal body of white people on the face of the earth. Did you get all that? He said that the number of purely white people in the world is proportionably very small. Well, he's right about that. But he goes on to say that all of Europe is swarthy complected except for the Saxons and the English, and that only the Saxons and the English make up the principal body of white people on the face of the earth. That was Benjamin Franklin, speaking at a time when he didn't have to be worried about any sort of division of white solidarity. He could speak his mind freely. And what he said was, don't let any of these Europeans in. If they ain't Saxon, if they're not English, don't let them in. The Spaniards, too swarthy. Italians, too swarthy. Okay, you can go with that. They're Southern Europeans. You know, the Moors got to them. But then he said the French and the Russians. You mean the guys out there freezing their butts off in Siberia? And the Swedes and the Germans. He says, ain't none of y'all white. Only the Saxons and the English are white. This was Benjamin Franklin who said that. When he said that the number of purely white people in the world was small, he wasn't talking about Europeans. He was talking about a small number of them. This is what was going on prior to 1865. Before the end of chattel slavery, this is the kind of stuff that was going on, the kind of divisions and enmity that existed among the Europeans. And a lot of that stuff is still around today. So here you have a man who would become one of the founders of the United States, and he was saying clearly what his definition of white was. And it excluded 95% of the people in Europe. Now, what do you think happens when all of those European immigrants decide that they want to come over to America? If anyone qualifies as the pale-skinned, blonde-haired, blue-eyed Aryan type, it would definitely be the Swedes. And yet, Benjamin Franklin said, don't let them in. If anything, the founding white supremacists of the United States should have been saying, let those guys in first. But understand, there were and remain strong cultural and historical antagonisms between European groups. Look at Ukraine and Russia, or Britain and France, etc. So for the founders of the U.S., being white wasn't enough. You had to be the right kind of white. Now, at first, the newcomers from Europe were given a hard time, mostly hazing. They were not oppressed, not at all. They were simply given a harsh lesson that they would have to earn the status of white. And by hazing them, the dominant society made it where whiteness was something to be aspired to by these groups. And the transition from Irish or German or Swedish to white wasn't an event. It was a process. As late as the 1890s, you still had books and publications like Puck magazine showing political cartoons warning that the Irish were simply not willing or even able to be assimilated into American society. And it wasn't just the Irish that they limited this criticism to. They also made it clear that they didn't like hyphenated Americans. You think that's a new term? It's not new at all. It's over 130 years old. And when you look at these cartoons from the 1890s, you see they weren't talking about black people. They were referring to other white people like the Irish, Germans, Italians, Dutch, etc. The call was for them to assimilate. But what did assimilate mean? Well, it didn't take too long for the newcomers to figure out that assimilate meant that they had to show they understood the foundation of American society rests on anti-black racism. They learned the rules of racism soon enough, though. Time and again, whenever immigrant groups came into the United States, you saw two distinct events happen. First, there was the effort to jockey for a place in the hierarchy, and secondly, we saw the demonstration of this desire to be accepted take the form of anti-black racism. Now, obviously, I'm not saying that every immigrant, be they from Europe, Asia, south of the border, or wherever, come here and immediately began going in on us. But immigrants don't come to a land in twos and fews. They don't show up as individuals. They show up in very large groups, like the Central American migrants, the Syrian refugees, the Ukrainians, etc. And it is these group dynamics where we see that immigrants understand what white power requires of them and how best to demonstrate they know what assimilate means. From the lynchings of black people by the Irish during the draft riots to the Italians who led the effort to shut black people out of the unions, all the way to the present with the anti-black racism from racist Latino politicians in Los Angeles. A few days ago, Tariq Nasheed posted a video where he played audio from a group chat he took part in which a group of non-FBA women were talking about black people's issues and saying they didn't think that they owe reparations. One of these women said that she was of Iranian descent and that her parents had come to the United States in the early 1980s. When it was pointed out that her parents had come to the United States to take advantage of the wealth that black people had generated, this woman said that her family didn't need America's wealth because her family already was wealthy before they came here. Of course, this woman is not living off of her parents' wealth. She went to college, got a degree, and is now making money off of the American economy. An economy that was only made possible by black people's uncompensated labor and the wealth that is kept away from us to this very day. But this is the woman who was saying that as far as she was concerned, she didn't owe any reparations. What does she have to make reparations for? You know, when it comes to immigrants or people who come to the U.S. whose ancestors didn't necessarily own slaves, I like to use this analogy. Suppose you're looking to buy a house and you see one in particular that's a lot nicer than the others on the block and you want it. If that house has any outstanding liens from the previous owner, then you'll become responsible for that debt. And if you tell the seller of the house that you didn't rack up that debt and as far as you're concerned, you're just here to enjoy the house, then the seller is going to tell you that if you love the 2-story home that sits on an acre of land, has a 2-car garage, a patio, 3.5 bathrooms, and a swimming pool, then you'll also have to take responsibility for the debts that go along with that house. You want the home, you inherit its debts. And if you still whine that the liens were incurred before you even set eyes on the house and you don't think you should have to pay any of it, then the seller will tell you that you need to select another house because the one you're looking at comes with debts that whomever enters that house will become responsible for. You look at comments and videos you see posted online, and you got a number of immigrants who try to play victim and say, "Why are you trying to force reparations on me?" Nobody's forcing reparations on anyone. You volunteered for it. As a black man, if I chose to immigrate to Germany, there's no way in the world the German government would let me tell them that my tax money shouldn't go to pay Holocaust survivors. And if I tried to say, well, I'm a black man and my people were being persecuted in America at the same time that the Jews were being persecuted in Europe, and our persecution is still ongoing today, the German government wouldn't care. They would simply say that Germany owes a historical debt, and if you want to be here, you got to pay it. Simple as that. Everyone knows that we're owed, big. But what they also know is that this is a white supremacist government that has made it clear they're not going to pay. Everyone simply assumed, though, that this would never change. But now they're seeing that the possibility is there that it will, and they're not taking it well. Oh, and another point that needs to be brought up. When this Iranian woman Tariq was talking to was asked why her family came to the U.S. if they had all that money, she claimed they came to the U.S. because they were being persecuted. If her folks left Iran in the 1980s, that means they were fleeing the Ayatollah Khomeini, who had taken power in 1979, just a few years earlier. I did a video about that a year or so ago. You can see it on this YouTube channel. I suspect that Iranian woman's family were collaborators with the previous ruler of Iran, the Shah. And when Khomeini overthrew the Shah, her parents fled Iran and came to the U.S. But if her family was being persecuted, quote unquote, then why did the Khomeini regime allow them to keep all their money? Why didn't the Khomeini government seize her family's assets? What kind of persecution involves letting the persecuted leave the country unharmed with wealth? Her words, not mine. Her family left Iran alive and well and with money to burn. What kind of persecution is that? Well, the only reason that she and her family didn't face persecution in the U.S. was because there had been black people who made it safe for her to come here decades before she got here. We didn't flee the oppression here. We didn't flee the persecution. We fought the persecutors and faced them down. She tried to make herself sound valorous, like a self-made woman, but her denials make no sense. Because unless she's still just living off of whatever money her parents came to the U.S. with, she is indeed partaking of the American economy that we built, and she's enjoying the fruits of the wealth that we generated, just like everyone else has. Benefits that neither she nor her parents had anything to do with by her own admission. She tried to use her Iranian background as proof that she didn't owe anything, even though black activism made it possible for her to come to the U.S. in the first place, to have access to an equal education, and to be able to get gainful employment, and to be able to speak her mind openly. The United States didn't do that for her. Black people brought that about. All the things that she takes for granted and tries to act as if they were the results of something she did, or as if the U.S. is just naturally a place that allowed her to come here and live the life she has, that's a fraud. Now, there's an overarching point that I want to bring up as to this subject in particular. There's a reason I do video essays about Britain or Israel or Bolivia or Iran or Asia. Some of you may think that it's strange. I always get some fools commenting, "But Professor, why are you telling us about this? Why we need to know about these other countries out there? That don't mean nothing to me." Now, the people who say that, these are lazy people with weak minds. They don't know anything about anywhere, not even where they live. They're experts on smoking joints or watching sports, but plumb dumb on survival. The reason you need to learn about these other places is because a lot of the anti-black racists you're going to have to deal with come from these places. These other countries have long-standing traditions of anti-black racism, which is why so many of these immigrants so easily make the jump to being fully on board with the racial hierarchy, and why so many of them get furious when they see us threatening it. White supremacy is sophisticated. It long ago figured out the need for buffer groups to be between itself and the people who it's directly oppressing. This society needs racial stratification, and the beneficiaries of anti-black racism need their goodies, giveaways, and guarantees to be baked into the cake and handed to them. They need that kind of social order to be in place. The United States is not the only country that practices anti-black racism. It also exists in the countries a lot of these immigrants come from. If someone is going to try to hide behind their background as a way to defend anti-black racism, then you need to know what their true background is. The people who think it's cute not to learn about these other groups or these other places, these are the exact same people whose minds are so weak they can't even keep up with the conversation, so they try to conceal their failure by claiming that we shouldn't talk about these other things. But these are the same people who don't want to hear anything about this country either, or their own condition. Ignorance is not noble, and it's not harmless either. Part of defeating anti-black racism lies in demonstrating that what they say makes no sense, that what they say isn't true. The ability to debate effectively is a key part of that. People will try to argue against your interests, and you need to be able to shut them down. A debate, properly done, isn't a debate at all. It's a lesson. You're simply teaching your opponent all the things they don't know. But you have to be well versed in order for that to work. This is why I have zero patience for the slack-jawed, pot-smoking good-for-nothings who complain whenever I talk about the Mossad, or about Bolivia, or about the enmity between the Irish and the British. White supremacy seeks to muddy the waters for the sake of confusing any sort of political discourse meant to level the playing field for black people. The goal is to justify keeping us at the bottom, and they do it largely by pointing to immigrant groups and saying that, well, if these immigrants aren't in the same condition as black people, then that proves it must be all black people's fault. The problem is there's a lot of immigrants who have gone along with that narrative. As we've seen with Candace Owens and Michelle Malkin and even people like Juju Chang, many try to weaponize being a person of color against black folks by claiming that, well, they're non-white, and that there's no racism because they said so. People do that to win brownie points with the dominant society. It's a lie told with a wink and a nod. Well, the way you deal with lies is by knowing the truth. You need to know what's gone on in these countries for the same reason Dr. Joseph Ben-Jochannan and Dr. John Henrik Clarke and Dr. William Mackey and so many others made it a point to know. Anti-black racists have benefited from our oppression and will lie about their own history and their own past, and you have to know what the lies are so you can shoot them down. Debating effectively is like poker. In poker, you don't play the cards, you play the opponent. It's not so much about what cards you've been dealt, it's about how well you size up your opponent and find ways to outmaneuver them and throw them off balance. The vociferous and often blatantly racist opposition that black people get whenever the term reparations is mentioned shows why the cross-racial alliance stuff totally failed. It was DOA. As we've seen in recent years, and most recently in Los Angeles, anti-black racists in many cases aren't even from white society. even though a lot of them identify as white on their driver's licenses. A lot of so-called people of color and so-called minorities are as anti-black as the worst member of the Aryan nation. The problem for them is that they're trying to thread a needle. They think white power has assigned them a rung on the racial ladder above us, and they want to keep it that way. White power lies to maintain its position, so people like Nuri Martinez understand that they have to do the same. But when white power brings them in for some abuse, all of a sudden they miraculously remember that they're not officially white, and they start trying to invoke our names and our history. That is, until white power lets up on them, and then it's back to business as usual. What all these people fear is the change we represent. All they've ever known is the racial pecking order with us at the bottom. The ugly truth that a lot of people don't want to have to accept is that white power has given a number of tangible benefits to certain groups, even though they're not classified as white. They receive certain social and economic access that black people don't. Sure, they don't get as much as those who the society considers to be white, but they do get something. And when they see us making moves that will change the status quo, they share the same hyper-anxiety of the dominant society. Well, facts don't change simply because people don't like them. The truth represents reality, and because of that, it doesn't have to be pleasant to hear, or at all convenient. The only thing the truth needs to be is true. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors: Richard A. Mitchell, Michael Clark, Ricketta Jackson, Aisha Mwamba, and Noel Williams. Salute to them, and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.